All right, me. It is the 30th. It's the end of January. What cat? And today is the general strike day, and I spent the day reading Mark Danielewski's Only Evolutions. I believe published in 2006, right? Good book. Not quite the book I think I was sold, right? But still very, very good book, right? It is, this book really has the inspiration for why I even like do these, right? This is also the only book that I had ever bought because of a TikTok or because of an Instagram reel or whatever. And it is because this was like listed as like this guy's like weirdest book that he read of 2019 or 2020 or whatever. And so I got it, and that's what started all of this, right? I don't remember anything else about that TikTok, so I can't, go like, oh, he didn't sell me on the book correctly. What I can say is that I knew that this was a strange book to read, and so I looked it up beforehand a couple weeks ago, and like I feel like I have a very different opinion as to what a lot of people were saying about this book. What makes this book hard is that there's no definitive start, right? It is about the cyclical nature of things and this relationship, and so it is, right? You're always starting in media res no matter what, and you never really get a clear, okay, now we're going to jump back and figure things out, right, and get some exposition, right? And so I think that throws a lot of people, right? I think it also throws a lot of people that like this is a book that has some like very heavy either fantasy or sci-fi or something of that sort kind of vision to things, right? Right, it's about two people that are always 16 and can't die when they eat this honey, and then one of them always dies, and the cycle starts all over again, right? And like in the world, I think, of where avid readers would read something like this, right, are also, I think, much more used to getting a lot more exposition heavy world building information, right? And that is that comes from all sorts of places, right, of traditional high fantasy, but also how we interact with media, right? The constant need for lore and trying to connect pieces and things. And this book doesn't really do a whole lot of that. It just kind of dumps you at the door and says, figure it out, pal. Which I think was refreshing in that sense. It doesn't explain how this all works, right? It just does. You get a little bit of information, but it just works, and this is just what the world is. Which I think is much more interesting, because then you get to talk about what some things mean. So yeah. Because it starts in media res, that makes it difficult. The other part that makes it difficult is simply just how you read this book. Because looking at this, it looks so strange. And I don't know if I can actually show exactly what it looks like, but the way it works is one side is one character, one side is the other. They're both on the same page, and you're reading them, but flipped, right? And so, if you don't know the author recommendation, right, of, read 8 pages at a time of each character and then flip. Read the other character for 8 pages, flip. If you don't know that going in, I can also see how you get very lost, right? I think the other thing that made this book a lot easier to read than I think a lot of people give it credit for is that, and I got this like I think 20 pages in, so I read the first 2 chapters of both sides. I was like, okay, this is how this is going to go, is that it is effectively narrative poetry, right? It's written in a very poetic sense. And if you break it down, right, you have 360 pages that you have to read 8 at a time per character. That's 45. So it's effectively, it's 45 poems that create a narrative structure. And it's the same 45 poems both ways, just from different characters' perspectives and through 2 different periods of US history, right? And so understanding that, understanding where you are within American history, given by the vague kind of dates that they give, makes this a lot easier to read, right? And so that certainly helped a lot that I got that and I understood that very, very quickly. And I think the other thing that also throws a lot of people is that what constantly happens is a noun will get named by a proper name, right? And this specifically happens with cars a lot, but it happens with everything, of where something will get named in the line up here, and then for the next 8 pages, it goes through like 15 different iterations of where it'll be like, hey, it's a Chevrolet Impala, and then it's a Plymouth Roadrunner, and then it's a Dodge 4x4 or whatever, right? And it goes on like this for constantly, right? And it does this with names too that are not Haley and Sam, of where it'll be the same basic name, so you understand who you're talking about. It'll be like the same structure of name, but the interior will change. There's a long ass name that starts with an A, where like it's the same person, but constantly throughout it'll change like the middle part of the name, right? And that's, I feel like that's intentional, right? Because I think it is a showing or a recollection that like this is a cycle that has constantly repeated over and over and over again for ad infinitum, right? And it doesn't necessarily matter which one it is, right? The only constants that matter are the story itself and Haley and Sam, right? So yeah, you know, I think grasping all those things very, very quickly made this reading a lot easier. Yeah. The thing I would say I was not prepared for, right? I knew for going in, right, that it's the concepts of they're always 16, these 2 main characters, Haley and Sam, that there's some time jumping around, and that right, I knew those 2 things going in, right? And that it's always summer, right? It's always summer, right? Which in terms of the actual book just means that they are 16 years old, but because they're effectively runaways, they don't need to go to school. To them it is always summer in the fact that they get to live in a 16-year-old summer, right? And you know, I was prepared for those things. I was not necessarily prepared for the romantic aspect of things, which I should have expected, right? I was also not prepared for the amount of description of sex, right? And it's one of those very, like, this happens a lot in like romantic fantasy, right? In modern romantic fantasy, of where like these ages are not correct, but and they are alarming, and then we give lenience for it because it's fantasy or because it is an outrageous premise, right? Right. I just saw it was like if a character is under 100 years old, that is the age that they are. But if they are over 100 years old, they're like between 20 and 35, right? And it feels very similar to this, of where these characters are 16. They're constantly described as being always 16, no matter what, no matter what, no matter what. But their souls and who they are as people have existed for so much longer, right? And so it's a very strange to read some of these things. That was very much a get me out of this chapter, please. But yeah. So I was that was definitely something I was not prepared for. Does it make sense within the story? Yes. Does it mean I want to read it? Not necessarily. And was I prepared to read it? Definitely not. But yeah. Yeah. From a actual plot and story standpoint, right? I mean, it's a love story, right? I don't think that's shocking. But I think it's very interesting that, like, because we were following two different timelines with two different characters and telling from two different historical perspectives and who these people are, right? You end up in this kind of weird situation of where, like, the way that this love story ends up getting described is, I mean, it's like the male version of Twilight, right? Which is the joke that always gets made. I shouldn't say always gets made, has been getting made more recently about pieces of media in which the guy gets to be like an imprint of whoever the reader is, and then the girls that this guy is falling in love with are either the edgy, but now I want to be like good in whatever sense that means, right? Or the I've always been good, but I feel broken, right? Which I think has been very highlighted very well with recent discourse about Dispatch, right? Because that is effectively what's going on there, of where you have blank white guy and then has two women lusting after him completely, and it makes no sense because he's just a guy. But yeah, right. And this very much feels like this, of where, like, when you read Sam's perspective, it starts in 1863 and goes to 1963 or 1962, 1963, I think it is. And it is the story of Sam and Haley falling in love. And in this version, Sam is like this upstanding gentleman gauntlet, very, very knight-like in a lot of ways. And Haley is the damsel in distress. But she's also the damsel in distress that is incredibly attractive and is has every single person they meet falling in love with her, right? And then when you read Haley's perspective goes from 1963 to 2063. And Haley's perspective is that Sam is just some guy, right? And he's a dork and he fumbles around a whole bunch. And she is Alaska Young, right? of being a teenager that is comfortable with who she is as a person, has a sexual streak already at this age, right? And is also very willing and very open to using the fact that she knows that she is attractive in some way to a lot of people to then get what she wants, right? It is the Alaska Young of it all. And I feel very uncomfortable when I have to say these things out loud because they are 16 years old, right? But that is what gets laid out by the book. And so, like, you're reading the same plot line, but you are seeing things in two very different perspectives, right? Which is very, very interesting. With that being said, I think one of the other things that makes this book very hard to read is the fact that a good chunk of the book, Danielewski does this thing of where, like, he wants to show that you're in a very specific time period. The dates don't always line up, of where, like, the dates seem kind of arbitrary, but it gives you the general vibe of when they are. But then what happens is some of this dialogue will be written, and it is just like slang word, slang word, slang word, slang word, slang word. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense stringing all these things together. It's just to give a vibe of where you are, right? Which also makes this very, very hard. But yeah. I think the other fun thing about this book is we don't get a lot of description of who our characters are, right? We just get told that they have these green eyes or hazel eyes with gold specks. They both have them, and they're always 16. That's pretty much all we really get. And so we get to the point of where in both stories they're trying to get married, right? And they finally get to see a county clerk. And in Sam's story, they go up, they ask for marriage license, and you get 3 options for what you want the county clerk to say, right? And it's written in kind of a strange way, but at that point you've gotten used to the idea that, like, anything said by the character that you're reading is left aligned or right aligned, and that anything that is said by anyone else has a dash and then italicized, right? Or something of that sort, right? It's notated in some way that it's someone else speaking. And you get 3 options for what you want the county clerk to say. And when it's Sam's story, this is the story that goes from 1863 to 1963, you get the options of they're too young, they can't get married because they're both too young, they're both 16. They can't get married because Sam is black, and therefore it'll be an interracial marriage, and therefore not allowed at this point in time. Or you'll get that Haley is Hispanic, right? I believe it's Hispanic because at an earlier point they spoke Spanish. I believe they did. I feel like I might be getting mixed up there, but it's such a fascinating choice, right? And the same thing goes with Haley's story of when they eventually get to see the county clerk to get married. The 3 choices you get are they're both too young, Haley and Sam are both women, Haley and Sam are both men, right? Because they're trying to get married before I don't remember what year it was, but when gay marriage was legalized in the United States, right? At a federal level, right? And I think it's just such a fascinating, like, here is something that is so small, but you as the reader get to make the choice of who these characters are, right? Which is, it's fascinating to me, right? Yeah. I think it's a very interesting book. I don't know if I would actively be like, you have to read this book to anyone, but I would definitely recommend it probably to like some other high school teachers that are looking for kind of weird, interesting books. I don't know if I would recommend this to someone that like is not someone who would read things for an academic purpose. I just think it is. It's slightly too strange, I think, to be read all the time by someone who is not trying their best to be well versed in literature, right? Of where they read a lot, but they tend to read the same things, right? But yeah, that is Only Revolutions by Mark Danielewski. Yeah.